Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special webinar on Great Plains drought conditions and fire outlook for summer 2025. My name is Joel Lisenby. I'm a coordinator for the Southern Plains Drought Early Warning System at the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS. I also sit at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado in Boulder. This webinar is being produced in partnership between the Missouri River Basin Drought Early Warning System and the Southern Plains Drought Early Warning System. The Missouri River Basin system is coordinated by Jason Gerlich, who's also on the line today. First, a bit of housekeeping items. On this webinar, everyone is muted and the webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording will be made available on the NIDIS YouTube channel and linked from the webinars page at drought.gov/webinars. And we'll send an email when the webinar recording has been posted. It may be later this week or early next week. If you are not receiving either Southern Plains or Missouri River Basin drought emails, you can sign up for email alerts at this website that I'm showing, drought.gov/drought-alerts/sign up, and select your region from the regional mailing list menu. And I'll show this information again at the end of the webinar if you missed it here. Oh, also we'll have time at the end of each presentation for a question or two. If you'd like to ask a question, use the GoToWebinars question box. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with NIDIS, we are a multi-agency partnership with a mission to mitigate the impacts and costs of drought and enable the nation to move from a reactive to more proactive approach to managing drought. NIDIS is organized geographically into drought early warning systems, for which this webinar covers two, which are circled here. You can learn more about NIDIS and drought in general by visiting drought.gov. I'm really looking forward to the presentations today. First, we'll hear from Eric Hunt. Eric is an agricultural meteorologist with the University of Nebraska in Lincoln with the Extension Agency there. He has helped lead or co-author multiple publications on drought. He's active in the Nebraska State Climate Office page and is a regular weather voice on Market Journal, KRVN, and KCIN. After Eric's talk, we'll have time for two, maybe three questions, and then we'll transition over to Chip Redmond. Chip is a meteorologist at Kansas State and the Kansas State Mesonet manager. He's also an incident meteorologist with a Rocky Mountain incident management team and provides support to major wildfires throughout the country when needed. So that wraps up the introductions. I'm going to pass over to Eric first, and I'm going to pull up Eric's slides here. And as soon as those are going, you can get started. Go ahead, Eric.
Hey, yeah, thanks for that introduction, Joel, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on which time of the basin you're in. Next slide, please. Just want to start off with the drought monitor for the basin. This was released earlier today. So again, this is based on data through 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock, depending on what time zone you're in, on Tuesday morning. So this would not necessarily reflect any precipitation that's fallen in the last couple of days. The good news, though, is we do have a little under half of the basin in drought. That is an improvement over where we were at the beginning of the spring, climatological spring, which has been 1st March. You'll notice here in the last 3 weeks, we have particularly seen improvement across a lot of the high plains region. So from the western Dakotas down in through Nebraska into parts of Kansas and Missouri. We do have some pockets on the outskirts that have seen some degradation. But the good news is we haven't seen any widespread degradation in the basin here in the last couple of weeks. Next slide, please. We did have a burn ban in place in the state of Nebraska for about a month. So from late April through about the first 2/3 of May, we did have a burn ban in place. This was prompted in part because of a major wildfire up in Brown County, which is in north central Nebraska. It was a controlled burn that got out of control thanks to a cold front getting in quicker than I think was anticipated. And at that point, we were really in really bad shape across a lot of the state and across a lot of the high plains region. I'll show you the soil moisture percentiles, how they've changed. But recent precipitation, so if we go back 60 days through early yesterday, you'll notice that where we typically have the most precipitation down toward the southeast corner of the basin, we've had closer to maybe 10 inches. We also have had maybe 10 plus inches across portions of the western Dakotas, and we have had 8 to 10 inches of rain across portions of Nebraska, particularly north central Nebraska as well. This is very, very badly needed precipitation. We have had a little bit less precipitation than that, certainly as we get toward the northwestern side of the basin, which would sort of be one of the reasons for the degradation of the drought monitor. And if we look at departures from normal going back 60 days, you'll notice that in general, the northwestern portion of the basin, with the exception of maybe the far northwest portion of Montana, we've seen a lot of positive departures from normal across the Dakotas. Again, so we got dumped on across portions of south central and north central south central North Dakota and north central South Dakota back about 3 weeks ago. A little bit drier across portions of eastern Nebraska and western Iowa and northwest Missouri. The good news, though, is we have been getting some recent precipitation, so that is starting to have a positive impact on soil moisture. Next slide, please. And the reason that we did get that heavy precipitation back in the third week of May at 500 millibars, which is about halfway up the atmosphere, we did have a relatively potent trough that came out of the west and moved into the Front Range region. And we also concurrently had ridging further toward the south, so we were able to get decent fetch from the Gulf. So what we really hadn't had the systems earlier in the spring were predominantly going, clapping the southeastern part of the basin, meaning like parts of eastern Nebraska and Kansas and Missouri were getting hit. So we weren't really getting that precipitation in March in the northwestern portion of the basin. And then as we got into April, like a lot of places weren't getting precipitation except for much further south. That's kind of flipped there mid-May, and in the last 2 or 3 weeks we have had pretty good precipitation, as I was just showing you earlier. The figure on the right, 925 millibars, would be a couple thousand feet above the surface, depending on where you are. But you'll notice that we had anomalous southerly flow, and then if you get in the upper part of the Midwest, you'll see that it kind of turns toward the northeast. It's basically showing for those couple of days when you had really good fetch from the Gulf around that area, around that surface low. We were kind of getting a lot of good wraparound precipitation. So that's one of the reasons that we were able to get some very robust precipitation totals across portions of the Dakotas. And what I'm showing you here, the evaporative demand drought index, I wouldn't really call it a true drought index in the sense of the term, because all it really is doing is comparing potential evapotranspiration compared to historical norms. You'll notice the last 3 weeks that because it's been cooler and some degree cloudier and with some smoke in there, we really haven't had a ton of atmospheric demand. So we're potentially evapotranspiration across most of the basin in the last few weeks has been relatively average or maybe even a little bit below average. But over the longer term, we have had a relatively prolonged period where we've been abnormally warm. We've had some higher wind speeds, and those are all things that would contribute to higher potential evapotranspiration. So going back 9 months, which would include pretty much the really warm, dry period in the fall, then some warmer weather in the winter, and then some warmer windier weather earlier in the spring. You'll notice that we are kind of in the 95th, in some cases, almost 100 percentile for potentially evapotranspiration during that time period. So looking at soil moisture currently, I made this map earlier this morning. So we still have some pockets of dryness across portions of southeastern Nebraska and eastern South Dakota, eastern North Dakota. But for the most part, though, in the basin, we see soil moisture in the Sport List, which is a robust NASA model, but a model nevertheless. But it is showing that across most of the basin, we kind of have near normal soil moisture, maybe even somewhat above normal precipitation or soil moisture across portions of North Dakota. And if we compare that to what it was like about 3 weeks ago, so before we started having all this significant precipitation, you'll notice that across a lot of north central Nebraska and western North Dakota and across portions of South Dakota as well, also portions of eastern Montana, east Wyoming, a lot of the basin we've seen actually some pretty decent improvement in soil moisture. Still have some dryness to contend with, but this is a big improvement over where we were earlier in the spring. And I also point out it has been just unusually wet across a lot of the southern plains and into the southeast. I do think that may be important for the next few weeks. So that area, when their soils are wet, that means that when we are getting a decent return fetch from the Gulf, that we're getting the full effect of that moisture. It's not being zapped at all by drier conditions to the south. So that may actually be somewhat fortuitous for us getting some better moisture return back up into the Missouri River Basin for at least the next few weeks when we have favorable atmospheric setup for that. Snow water equivalent in the Missouri River Basin, so like the entire West, which includes some of the Missouri River Basin, is below the median. Now, if you were looking at this through most of the winter, early spring, like I was, for a good portion of winter, a lot of this was kind of closer to average. Some were a little bit above average, some were a little bit below average. But we saw things drop off significantly in late April and early part of May. So if you look at the temperature departure, which is getting a little bit dated at this point, but from April 12th to May 11th, it was quite warm across a lot of this region. So we saw a pretty early melt off of snow across a lot of the Rockies, hence the reason for the being well below the median. Next slide, please. And this is one example. So you notice that I believe this is from a site in northeastern in northern Colorado. So that black line is the current water year. So we actually were, kind of near the median for a good portion of winter, maybe a little bit below. But you'll notice that we had much earlier melt off than usual. So I mean, it was mostly gone by early May, whereas there are a lot of years we would still have had about at least another couple weeks of decent snowpack. Looking at rangeline conditions across the region, the what I'm showing you on the left is for bed strife. So bed strife, if you're unfamiliar with it, combines satellite reflectance and a longer term standardized precipitation index. So it combines the satellite reflectance to give us a measure of vegetation health and also combines the meteorological data. And the numbers are representing the percentage of passers from the latest NAS update that show being in poor to very poor. The good news is we actually, particularly in North Dakota and South Dakota, seen some real improvement, starting to see some improvement in Nebraska. But those percent poor, very poor numbers in the Dakotas have come way down here in recent weeks. And I'm hoping we'll start seeing similar conditions here in Nebraska. Still some, poor pastures across portions of our northwestern base up in Montana. But if you look at grass cast, so the left portion of that shows assuming normal precipitation. That's kind of a proxy for how well forage and grasses will grow. So it's kind of a proxy for forage production, even if it's not exactly that. So if we get average precipitation, there is a good portion of the basin that can expect somewhat normal conditions. Now, Chip will talk about this later about how that may relate to fires. But if we get below average precipitation, which has been kind of the expectation for the summer, then a lot of places are probably looking at a bit of a decline in production relative to normal, with the exception of maybe parts of South Dakota got absolutely drenched back in May. There's a portion of southwestern Nebraska, kind of around McCook, that is pretty much likely going to be below average on forage production this year, even if they end up, unless we just end up super wet for the rest of the summer. Okay, so what I'm showing you here are the current sea surface temperatures. I thought I had some circles drawn in here, but we are essentially kind of in ENSO neutral conditions. So if you look in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific, we kind of have a mix of somewhat cooler and somewhat warmer, more or less neutral conditions. What I'm most interested in, though, going forward is that cooler water off the Baja California and kind of what happens in the north part of the Pacific. So if that stays relatively warm for most of the summer, then I do think that is a little better signal for us in the basin getting at least chances of precipitation, particularly the eastern portion of the basin. If that starts going over a little bit colder, then I think there is going to be an enhanced risk of the entire basin being below average for precipitation, probably warm going into the most of the summer. Next slide, please. So that ENSO forecast, this was released last month. So we are currently in neutral conditions. The expectation is that we will remain in neutral through the summer. There is at least a reasonable chance that La Nina will redevelop later as we get toward the winter. There's also about a 1 in 10 chance that we will be in El Nino by later this year. So just looking a little bit further down the road, we have been relatively cool here of late. I think that's probably going to start changing as we get into later portion next week, and probably through a good portion of the rest of June. We'll probably see more ridging being prominent over the eastern 2/3 of the country. So it should keep us relatively warm across most of the basin. There are probably going to be chances of getting some precipitation. So notice the equal chances of dry and wet. So basically this means there's no real strong signal one way or the other, but I do think there will be at least chances of getting some precipitation. So I think that's continued good news for our pastures and some of our crops that need the moisture to finish out the season or to kind of get started depending on the crop. So why am I concerned about this summer? So what I'm showing you on the left is the PMM. So that's the Pacific Meridional mode. So that's if that's in the negative phase, that means the water's colder off the coast of California. So how you can interpret this is that those warm colors in the central U.S., that basically means that there is a stronger correlation with a negative, with a PMM being leading to more ridging over this portion of the continent with more troughing off the west coast. So that kind of gets you that ridge trough pattern that is not good for us from a drought perspective. And also showing you on the right the Pacific decadal oscillation. So when it's in its positive phase, you tend to have warmer water on the eastern side of the North Pacific versus over toward Japan. We have more or less been in the negative phase of PDO for the last 5 years, and I do think that that is at least a good. If it's not, it's really not the entire blame. It definitely deserves a lot of the blame for the amount of drought that we've had in the basin and a lot of the western United States in the last 4 or 5 years. But what that's basically showing is if you have a negative PDO late summer and into early fall, you tend to have more ridging over the western United States, which tends to mean more suppression of precipitation and warmer temperatures. For the drought outlook, this was released last week. So the CPC is expecting drought to redevelop across portions of the northern plains. So again, a lot of the basin, if you're not currently in drought, there's an expectation that you will be in drought by the end of the summer, with maybe a couple of exceptions. And reason for that, the rationale again. So they, at least from this standpoint, it makes sense by their logic. They're expecting below average precipitation across the basin and warm temperatures. So that's a pretty good recipe for drought. I think will be interesting. I don't necessarily doubt this statistically. I think there is a very good probability that this will come to fruition. The $1 million question is, do we get timely rains that mean that, yes, we may be statistically dry across a lot of the basin, or at least portions of the basin. But if we get timely rains, that means from an agricultural standpoint, we probably are not having significant reductions in crop yields. And that also may mean that drought may get a little bit worse from a statistical standpoint, but it may not have the agricultural impacts. Certainly, I think some of the hydrologic impacts would maybe get slightly worse. But if we end up just being very, very dry, then I think we are going to be in a very bad situation by the time we get into Labor Day. And this is a totally kind of different opinion. This is from the European model. They actually just released this, I believe, yesterday, based on their latest data. So they're kind of showing the same thing the CPC is. So they're showing dry, which is on the left, and they're showing warm for pretty much the entire basin. So I mean, the drought risk later this summer is definitely real. The good news is we have seen some improvement in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So we, at least if we're going to get turned back over warm and dry, we are at least doing so from a starting point that isn't quite as bad as it was a month ago. Next slide, please. And just another opinion. Again, I'm not a huge. The CFS has its issues, and the GFS has had a lot of issues of late. But I'm showing you basically to show that it is also expecting warmer and drier for a good portion of the basin. So they're really, from a modeling perspective, there's not much out there that shows something different than warm and dry for the basin as we get the last, certainly the back half of summer. And this is what I'm going to call this is the Grand Forks early 95-degree rule. So I came up with this. So Grand Forks, North Dakota hit 95 in first part of May. So the years where they've hit 95 before Memorial Day, since 1980, would be several years in the 80s and then 2006. So ironically enough, this hasn't happened a whole lot here in the last 30 years. But you'll notice in those years, from a composite standpoint, it tends to be dry in the basin. It tends to be warm. So that early 95 is more or less, that is a symptom of the atmosphere is putting a lot of ridging over the north central portion of this continent. And history would show that if you get that at some point in May, you tend to get it repeated at least for periods of time in the summer, if not the majority of the summer. So again, this kind of really matches that PMM correlation. So there's a possibility that if the Pacific meridional mode is a dominant factor in our sensible weather as we get later in the summer, then we probably are going to be dealing with more ridging over the basin, which would mean warmer temperatures and probably somewhat reduced precipitation at times, if not for a good portion of the summer. And that's pretty much all I have. So I will take time for questions. Again, Chip will probably kind of tie some of this in later with wildfire potential, but I'm happy to answer a couple of quick questions here.
Fantastic, Eric. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I've got two questions right now. One is, how did the rapid snowmelt impact hydrology across the Missouri River Basin?
Oh boy, that's an excellent question. I don't think I have a great response to that. Sorry.
That's quite all right. The next
I did not take a look at recent stream flows from USGS. I know across a lot of Nebraska we were down in May, earlier in the spring. So my guess is that we probably had some increase in flow earlier we normally would have. So it's possible though that some of the recent precipitation in parts of basin though have made the flows probably stay up a little bit more. But it's my long-winded way of saying I don't have a great response to that question. I
quite,
apologize.
that's quite all right. The next one is: do you have any information about crop conditions coming into summer? How do things look right now?
Sure. So my understanding is this is the third worst start on record to spring wheat. Now, again, I think some of that is probably just how wet it was in North Dakota. Maybe there's some dryness in parts of Montana. So I mean, it might be a combination of those two things that's leading to some issues there. Winter wheat crop in Nebraska is not great. There's parts of the state where it's doing okay. Certainly, the southern panhandle is really struggling because of the how dry and warm last fall was, and it's been up until pretty recently had been pretty dry, so the lifespan hasn't been very good. The other row crops, I think it's a little too early to say on corn as you get further toward the east. Right now, I would say things around here look pretty good, and we think we actually could use a little bit of warmer weather. The good news is the crops around here have a shot at being pretty good, but we really don't have a lot of margin for error just because we just did not get enough precipitation earlier this spring to have a really full profile of moisture. So if we do turn over dry later this summer, there's going to be problems in western Iowa and Nebraska and South Dakota and North Dakota.
Okay. Well, thanks for that intel. It's really useful, Eric. I really appreciate your time. Next, we're going
Yeah,
to hand
thank
it
you.
over. Yeah, you're welcome. Next, we're going to hand over to Chip Redmond, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the what we're seeing around fire coming uh, with the season ahead.
All right, good. Hello, everyone. My name is Chip Redmond, I'm a meteorologist at K-State. I really appreciate Joel for having me on here and everyone at NIDIS. So we'll give it's a great outlook by Eric. I will say the wheat down this far south has actually kind of been plagued by moisture a little bit, got a lot of disease, but we need some dry conditions to dry things out and to start getting harvest going because we're at that point already in the year. Pretty crazy how fast we move forward. So let's look at the fire perspective of the outlook moving forward. When we think about fire behavior and fire conditions that are conducive for large fires, especially those are the ones we're most interested in. We don't really focus on topography a whole lot. It's weather and fuel that drive fire across the plains. We need the fuel to be in the right stage, and that's all dependent on what the preceding weather has been. And then obviously, as we look forward, we try to put that together with the weather conditions to see when weather and fuels will align to properly get to get fire occurrences across the landscape. So when we look at green up as a whole, it progressed pretty rapidly across a lot of the central plains, slowed down when it went over Oklahoma, and so because of cooler conditions. But then we had that warm period in early May that really moved things along. And because of that, we started having grass growth earlier than normal. Some areas I know in far north are just got to their green up thanks to the cooler weather that checked it up. But areas where we have darker colors there are areas that we saw earlier than normal green up, and we already had vegetation actively growing when we get that precipitation in. And so that helps to earlier grass growth gives us a bigger window and gives us more opportunity, especially the cool season grasses, to get more established and to get taller. And we're really concerned kind of about that fuel loading of grass. Those conditions of warmer than normal through the March through May period helped advance that green up, but precipitation was void a lot, so it slowed it down over Nebraska and northern Kansas. But areas where we saw precipitation anomalies in the positive and those greener areas on the right, those are the areas we saw more advanced grass growth and earlier than normal grass growth. However, ironically, in May, things slowed down a little bit, especially in the central plains here around Kansas, southern Nebraska, and then down even into Oklahoma and northern Texas. We've had cooler than normal weather, combined with precipitation and overcast skies, and we're actually not getting the growing degree units we need to help continue that grass growth. Granted, it's good because we're keeping the soil moisture around. We're improving drought, as we saw in Eric's presentation, and that's all good. But we're just not quite getting the grass growth because we need heat to help get that grass growth. You look further north, though, portions along or areas along the Canada border, I have definitely seen warmer than normal temperatures, but not as much precipitation. So grass growth is definitely a little bit slower there. Additionally, like Eric mentioned, our atmospheric demand for moisture through wind, solar radiation, heat has actually been below average for a lot of the Central Plains, or near average for the last month. It's those areas further north that have had fire occurrences over the last month or so that they've seen those higher stresses, and because of that, vegetation is going to struggle to grow because there's just no moisture available for it. So when we look at how much are those grasses going to grow throughout the rest of the growing season, soil moisture is really, really important. And right now, the profile has been really improved across the high plains and into Kansas and Oklahoma. So when we do finally warm up, and I say finally warm up because it feels like it's been forever since we saw the sun here in Kansas. I know that's not the case for some other areas. But when we warm up and we start getting that summer heat across the plains, vegetation is going to grow very quickly. And I think as a result, those areas where we have above normal soil moisture right now are going to be areas of focus for above normal fuel loading or grass loading that are the primary fire carrier across the Central Plains. I know there's some anomalies there, like the Black Hills and other forested areas, but grass is a big carrier, especially in those pasture lands, and we need that to be a good crop to be able to carry fire. So unfortunately, it looks like we are going to face some above normal grass loading, and I think that grass cast captured it pretty well. I just took the average grass cast here, and those areas of blue and green are areas where we're going to see average to above average grass and fuel loading across the region, and that's going to help sustain. If we do dry that grass out, it's going to help sustain fire and help it get more established. So we need to look at those weather conditions, and we need to see what's going to happen. So first, right now, the current status of fuels across the region, honestly, we don't have a lot of areas that are really dry. If we look into the northeast Montana, northwest North Dakota, we look at energy release component, and that is a component of basically how hot the fire is when it moves across the landscape. And so the higher it is, the more volatile fuels are, the more they can carry fire. And in the last week, we've had a pretty substantial decrease in energy release component in this region. We can see the purple arrow showing the significant drop correlated with the precipitation and cooler weather over the last week. However, look at the forecast in that black arrow. The forecast over the next 7 days is it for it to actually start to increase. That gray line that's there at the bottom is normal, and we're going to get back above normal and potentially see fire return, or the potential for fire to return across this landscape in the next week with becoming much warmer and drier conditions. We scoot a little bit further south, things are in much better conditions. We've had a lot more moisture, we've had a lot more cooler weather, and as a result, ERCs are well below normal here in southeast Wyoming, western Nebraska, and over the next 7 days, going to stay that way. It's going to need a longer duration period of warmer, drier conditions to make this grass available to burn. I look further, and I highlight northern Minnesota just because that's the area where fire has been focused on in the region. And we have had some improvements in the last week or so, and we're actually expecting continued improvements over the next 7 days with some moisture around, not necessarily widespread precipitation, higher humidity to hopefully check up that. We still are having at to slightly above average ERCs, though, which means fire is still going to actively burn, and it's going to be aggressive. However, typically as we move through the summer months, you see those ERCs, they kind of stay plateaued until you get to about August and they start falling off. So there's a lot of fire season to go, and this area is going to need really timely moisture and more moisture to help offset fire weather concerns as we move into the future. So peak fire season for this time of the year, or for this region, is really that July in the top right there in August is when we start seeing fire occurrences, and those kind of bleed over into September as well. This is from the Storm Prediction Center fire occurrence data. And as we move forward, we enter this time of the year, things change, and we can really cure out fuels much quicker than we can in the spring when we get in that precipitation, or in the winter they're already cured out and dormant. So things can change really rapidly with just a couple of weeks of hot, dry conditions across the plains, and that's why we see fire occurrences increase as a result. So looking towards that forecast, I have this. We had a weak La Nina this spring, and I've been using that kind of as a method to look forward and look at the analogs and see, hey, years we had weak La Nina in the spring that did diminish. What happened that following summer? And typically we see below average precipitation across most of the central United States, with the exception of Texas. And it's really a good example of near normal precipitation in the West. And I think that tells a bigger story, because we typically have high pressure that builds up there in the West over the summer during weak La Nina. And I think we're seeing that because that provides a monsoonal moisture flow. We'll talk about that in a second. Additionally, we have a negative Pacific decadal oscillation, and that was mentioned in Eric's presentation as well, and that really favors drier than normal conditions across the central region of the United States. And basically it takes that high pressure and actually shifts it just slightly to the east. And that orientation of that ridge of high pressure is going to be really important to determine what kind of fire potential we have across the landscape and how much moisture we can feed into it. We have two source regions for moisture for the monsoonal ridge of high pressure that can develop across the western United States. The East Pacific, which we just saw a storm in the East Pacific, we have another one potentially in the next 7 days, so it's already active. And the Gulf system, not necessarily a tropical storm, but that moisture can also fuel moisture into the southwestern United States. And that's important because that moisture eventually rotates around that high pressure. It rotates clockwise around that high and comes out across the northern plains in the central plains. Unfortunately, with this kind of a pattern, if that high shifted far enough east, that's not going to necessarily be favorable for precipitation across the plains. And so when we look at those 500 millibars, we're looking at the mid-level of the atmosphere. Those regions of orange we see both in the post-weak La Nina on the left and then a negative PDO on the right say, hey, there is going to be high pressure across the west. They have different locations of it and different intensity, but where that sets up is going to be important, because if it sets up too far north and we can't tap into that moisture, then potentially it could be a very, very dry summer, like Eric was hinting at. It's all about the placement of that high pressure. We do have some critical fire weather patterns that typically result with high pressure across the west. Just focus on two that kind of impact more the plains region as a whole. One is the high pressure breakdown. So when that ridge starts to get weak low pressure systems that slam into it from the west, they start to break that down. That allows for stronger wind events and more lightning events. And then the other critical fire weather pattern is dry lightning. When we have monsoonal moisture in that high pressure and it's spinning around, that is great for those areas where we get thunderstorms repeatedly over time and time again. Unfortunately, that's typically over the highest terrain. Once those storms start to move off to the east, they don't have as much moisture with them, tend to have a little bit more wind, and we see dry lightning develop more fires, unfortunately. So when we look at just the instability, I looked at CAPE. This is convective available potential energy, basically thunderstorm fuel, moisture in the mid-levels and cooler weather in the mid-levels that can help fuel those thunderstorms. Post-weak La Nina, we actually see an anomaly there of increased CAPE across the just east of the Rocky Mountains. And we look at the negative PDO, that signal is even more amplified. It says, hey, we typically have a lot of instability, a lot more than normal instability across the high plains in the east of the Rockies, which means there is more potential there for thunderstorm activity, maybe more potential for dry lightning as well. And we look at some of the model data. This is the MMME model. I like to say it's the average of all models. It picks up in that yellow circled area for July on the left and August on the right. It picks up normal to slightly above normal precipitation in the southwest, which is indicative of maybe at least a normal active monsoon. But look at those dry anomalies to the north and east of it. That moisture, when it rotates out north and east of that true monsoonal low, it has dry air underneath it. It evaporates all that precipitation, and we end up with more dry lightning outbreaks and not getting those wetting rains we really need. So when we think about it, we could potentially have some above normal grass loading, fine fuel loading across the plains, and we're going to have the potential for more dry lightning. Unfortunately, that typically means more fire occurrences and maybe even above normal fire activity. But there's a couple limitations. We need to dry things out. Like I said, it only takes a week or two to dry things out with the seasonal outlook of warmer than normal temperatures and below normal precipitation. That would suggest that we would be able to dry things out and be able to carry fire pretty adequately, especially across the Central Plains and Northern Rockies. But it's all about that timely moisture Eric mentioned. We have to have timely moisture. That would be enough to check it up. We can just get the right time when things start to dry out. We get a rain event. Typically in drought, we grow some of our best crops when we have those timely rain events. And even those statistics will still say we were in a drought. So unfortunately, that's hard to pin down. Where it looks like summer's finally starting to build in here over the next several weeks, and especially by the end of next week. And that'll be the time we start to watch, especially seeing those forecasts for ERCs in the northern plains. There's definitely potential there for fire occurrences to increase as you get towards the end of the month. So with all that in mind, NIFC has put out the chance of significant wildfire potential across the nation. June, top left, most of the plains are free. We're still a little bit worried about that Minnesota, northern Wisconsin area, just because of what we saw. Those ERCs are still slightly above normal despite the recent precipitation. Moving into July in the top right, we started to see the northern Rockies get more active, maybe some lingering concerns in northern Minnesota. It's really going to depend on if we can keep an active pattern going and be able to shift some of this precipitation north. We've had so much precipitation to the south and expecting more over the next week. I think that's really going to check up some of that above normal large fire potential there in Oklahoma and Texas. It's going into August, though, we start to see those northern Rockies region of above normal fire concerns bleed out into the plains. And I think that's that high pressure building in, and we get lightning with those conditions. We're just going to get a lot more fire starts and a lot more opportunities for large fires. And that's going to likely persist into September in the bottom right. So all heavily going to depend on the tropical pattern and tropical systems. If we can get moisture up in the north into the western monsoon ridge, and where that goes from there, it would be hard to dictate out this far. So to summarize, I think both the negative PDO and a weak spring La Nina, post-weak La Nina, suggest drier than normal conditions across the plains. I think our current soil moisture is going to yield above normal grass loading. And with the monsoonal pattern we're likely to see, I think we're going to see more fire ignitions and less wetting rains, unfortunately, and that's resulted in above normal significant fire potential for the northern plains. I will say I didn't talk about wind a whole lot. Wind is a tricky beast, more week out kind of thing. We need to have the right pattern, the right setup. Subtle changes can make big differences in wind across this region. I think the storm activity that we're going to likely see across the northern plains, and that some of these analogs point to, outflow winds are going to be a big driver of fire behavior, which is not abnormal for that neck of the woods. And thunderstorms daily could become big problems if we have outflows from them from different directions each day. It just becomes hard to put a fire out. So once again, thanks for having me, and I will take any questions.
Fantastic, Chip. So interesting. Tons of great information. I have the first question. There's something I wanted to talk to you about, and it's something that you and I were talking about right before we started this webinar. Is that I've noticed that the southern plains are seeing an improvement of drought and this increase in wet weather, while the northern plains are seeing things tending to dry out, especially with the outlooks looking this summer. And Kansas is right in the middle. You've got you're almost like in this friend zone where you're not like breaking up with drought and you're not quite coming into it yet. Can you talk about this north-south split that we're seeing in Kansas? How frequently does that happen in our climate system? And maybe what what tends to nudge that in the middle zone, north, south, or east or west?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had the the great answer for that. And it's very challenging, and it's hard for us too to try to figure out if we're going to truly be over drought and move on and be able to start doing some new drought planning, but we never truly get out of it. I think a lot of it plays a role in the tropical systems, like this system here this week that brought some flooding rains to Kansas. That was from the East Pacific, and it plays a huge role in the amount of moisture we can get in some of these early summer and even middle of summer events that can be a deal breaker for us. And so over all those typical patterns, we rely on averaging those out over a long period of time and trying to get out of drought. And so the north-south split really is defined, I think, as well with the negative PDO. I mean, it shunts a lot of that moisture off to the east in the cool season. And so by the time we finally get that pattern aligned where we can get moisture in Kansas and shift it far enough west, by then the summer pattern wants to kick in, and we start seeing that pattern actually shift north, the active pattern, and we kind of end up void of precipitation. So, it's a 10-year plus long decadal long oscillation. And so until we see that PDO start to flip towards a positive, which it hasn't been for about 10 years, at least for a long period of time, we're going to continue to see these challenges across the plains of consistent battle of dry conditions.
So it's sort of like, well, first of all, that's really interesting, and I want to look, probably after this webinar, I'm going to look a little more deeply into the PDO and its dynamics across the United States. But it's an interesting way that I really like how you sort of painted that picture for us and described why there's the split and why it's hard to really understand the variability that happens in the central part of the plains. So thanks for that. Next up is not a question, but a comment for you and possibly also for Eric if he's still listening. It's a comment from Dennis, and he says, here in north central Montana on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, our grasslands are looking really great. Significant precip so far. The healthiest I've seen our grasses in a long time. So just a little bit of an observation from there in north central Montana. And while I think that's great news, Chip, you also talked about the risk of what happens when those grasslands dry out. Do you want to make a comment on Dennis's comment?
It looks great. I'm really happy for y'all. I know how hard it is to get good pasture, especially in that neck of the woods. But yeah, that definitely is a concern as we move forward. And as those grasses dry out in the spring, or in the summer, there's going to be more carrier for fire, and you're going to see fire spread much more efficiently, and you're going to see a higher potential for large fire activity because of that. So it's a great opportunity to try to think about, hey, what can we do to mitigate some of those issues? What can we do to make sure that the grass is cut back? We've got barriers to spread, and that might play a role. Maybe some folks in the amount of livestock they put out and the amount of haying they do, just because we can build up more barrier and try to be proactive in this opportunity while things look good, we'll have less of a problem when things potentially do escalate later in the summer.
Thanks, Chip. I'd like to remind those who are attending that if you would like to ask a question of Chip, go ahead and add your question to the questions box. Those were the only two questions that we had come in so far, so we've got a little bit extra time. If anybody would like to bring up anything interesting or a question that you have for Chip, right now is the right time. I don't see any new questions coming in, so we might wrap up a little early. I think that's okay. I don't think anybody will complain about finishing up just a few minutes before the planned time. Thanks to everybody who participated. Thank all of you for attending today's webinar. Thanks for those who sent in a few questions and also for the comments. Just as a reminder, this webinar will be posted online. The recording of this webinar will be posted online at drought.gov/webinars within the next few days. And we will also send around an email with the recording when it's available. As mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, if you're not receiving emails about your local drought early warning system, please sign up. Here's a QR code that will take you to the sign up page, or you can go to that website And when you get there, find your region in the drop-down menu, and we'll start sending you information about drought early warning, some drought status updates, and information about upcoming events and webinars like this. Finally, as you exit the webinar today, you'll be invited to take a short 1-minute survey about this webinar. These surveys help us to know at NIDIS if we're creating value in putting these webinars together, and what things we could do differently to provide more value from webinars like this in the future. So please take just 1 minute, give us your thoughts about how this went and what information, how you'll use this information and what things you might want to see in the future. I'd like to finally just huge thanks again to our two presenters today, Eric Hunt and Chip Redmond. Thank you for sharing your time and your expert knowledge with us. This information has been really interesting, and I think you both presented it very well and in a way that was easy for us to understand. So thank you very much for that. And that concludes today's webinar. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.